Very great honor to be here. I probably should explain the title. I wasn't going to, but it's such a peculiar title. This relates back to my first childhood encounter with the idea of apocalypse. I don't know if you can cast your mind back to that time when you're very small and you're trying to realize the scope of everything suddenly changing. For me, it was when somebody tried to explain how big China is. And I was a very small boy, I was probably 4 or 5, and somebody said, well, there's almost 1 billion people in China. And I was 4 or 5, what's 1 billion? You don't know. So the adult said to me, put it this way, if everyone in China jumped at exactly the same time, the world would be jolted off its axis and go spinning off into space. But don't worry, that will never happen. Now, you cannot say that to a small boy, especially a born warrior, which I was. And so I used to pray every night, dear God, please look after mummy and daddy, etc., 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 world peace, etc., etc. And then at the end, and please don't let everybody in China jump at the same time. Now, I've grown up. Whoa. Please don't let every British person shout at the same time. Of course, that is childish nonsense. But I chose it for the title of my book for 2 reasons. The first one is that it shows how our fears of China are sometimes irrational. It's the Oriental other, the big unknown, that we project our hopes and fears on, sometimes to extremes. The other reason, however, is that I think there is a reason to be concerned about what is happening in China. But it's not that China is far away and distant and unusual, quite the opposite. The reason to be concerned about China now is that it is becoming more like us, and we are the problem. Our unsustainable lifestyle might work at the moment not very well with 1 billion people in rich countries having made the jump to an unsustainable lifestyle. There are several billion coming up behind in India and Indonesia and Brazil that want to make the same jump. And right in the middle is China. And that's why its position is absolutely pivotal and absolutely crucial. Now, before I go on, I'd just like to ask you, I'll talk briefly about the story of China, but can I ask you to, first of all, I want to see how much trouble I'm going to have. How many of you have actually been to China? Please raise your green card. Oh dear, right, okay, I better be careful. Now, how many of you, please raise a red card if this is the case, how many of you think, or rather, how many of you are worried about China? Honestly. Right, okay, that's probably a little more than half. And then, how many of you are hopeful that China can find a new solution? Even more. Oh, that's very encouraging. This is the right people to be in the lead. And the final question, how many of you answered that you are worried and hopeful? Okay, you are the people, I think, who know China the best. My favorite aphorism about China is that if you are incapable of holding 2 mutually exclusive ideas in your head at the same time, then you will never understand China. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about where I think China is going, to try to tell you the situation on the ground, which is very, very diverse. So I'll use some pictures to try to illustrate it. Also, to show what China's trying to do to solve its problems, and really to emphasize that I think what this shows more than anything else is that business as usual is not an option. When we get to China's stage, I think the economic development model has started to break down. It's reached its limits. So I'll start with a very brief video. I hope this will work. It's a long click. Yes, there you go. Okay, I don't know if we can turn the lights down. This is a lake. This is a lake in southern China that I visited last year that you can see has completely dried up for the first time in history, in living memory at least. What you can see on the ground here, these are shells of fish. And all the old people there have never seen this before. And I start with this because I think water is China's biggest problem. And it's not just in the south. This is now in the north, near Inner Mongolia, another lake that has completely dried up. And I think this really shows an overuse of resources as well as the problems of climate change that we all know very well about. And of course, it has knock-on effects. When you don't have water, you can't feed your cattle and water your cattle properly. You also degrade the soil. And so a big problem in China is desertification and dust storms that blow all the way across China, Korea, Japan, and in some cases reach the west coast of the United States. So this is, I think, the worst of China's problem, the darkest side. And now I will briefly, I want to show some of the good things. And they tend to be engineered solutions. China is doing amazing things when it comes to trying to engineer a solution to its problems. This is the South-North Water Diversion Project, the world's biggest hydroengineering project. This is a clean coal, supposedly clean coal plant up in Inner Mongolia. And this is research into using algae to absorb carbon dioxide and later use the algae for animal feed or even for fuel. And of course, the well-known story of China's investment in renewable energy, in wind, in solar. Last year, China invested $54 billion in renewable energy, clean tech, more than 40% more than the second country, the United States. And then, of course, finally, as well as the solar, we have the story of wind, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now, that's all for the video. I just wanted to show there that there is this Jekyll and Hyde. There is black China, and then there is green China, and they coexist at the same time. Now, I've been very fortunate to spend 8 years in China and to get a front seat to everything that's going on. And what it's made me realize is that China is in a remarkable situation. It's often said that China is just following a development path that other nations have done. I think it's different because of its speed, because of its scale, and also because of its timing. China is basically a 3,000-year-old civilization in the body of an industrial teenager. It's mega-rich, it's dirt-poor, it's overpopulated, under-resourced, ethnically diverse, and it's going through several levels of development simultaneously. It's coal-addicted, and yet it's trying to pioneer new energy technologies. It's communist-led, it's capitalist-funded, it's a giant traveling at unprecedented speed. And if all of that is not enough of a challenge, it's also trying to do something that is unprecedented in world history. It is trying to re-engineer an economy before it has finished industrializing. Now, thanks to my job, I've had a front seat on this really amazing story, and you get to see how important China is. I think you're listening to me because you know how important China is. The decisions you make will mean nothing, as Per said, unless they somehow incorporate China and what is happening in China. Think of the biggest decision that the EU has to take at the moment, whether to go from 20% emission cuts to 30% emission cuts. Seems huge, doesn't it? But the International Energy Agency said earlier this year that that difference in the EU of 20 to 30%, that 10% difference, that is equivalent to 3 weeks emissions in China. And that really puts things in context. And if that's not enough, China also has some of the greatest bio-wealth that it's losing very rapidly. I'd like to start with a picture of what China can be, what it is, the best of China. And it's often forgotten that there are places like this. This is in Sichuan, and the place called Zhoujiaigou. And the forests of the forests of Sichuan, rather, have more species than all of North America. So an amazing amount of wealth to lose. China has more ice cover than anywhere else except the Arctic or the Antarctic. And of course, many of those glaciers are melting. It also has fast expanding deserts. This is actually the horizon in Xanadu, up in Inner Mongolia. And of course, it's dependent on mines, we know that. So I don't just get sent to all these wonderful places. I've been to far too many coal mines and waste dumps and seen some of the dirtier side of China's environment. And also been able to witness the absolutely remarkable story of hundreds of millions of people being lifted out of poverty. So the question that's often asked is, what color is China? Is it communist red China that we should be frightened of? Or is, as Tom Friedman sometimes writes in the New York Times, should we half hope, half fear a green China that's overtaking the rest of the world in terms of renewable energy? Well, in my 8 years in China, I would say that neither of those colors is quite right. The fears of red China are outdated. The hopes for green China are still premature. The color I would associate from these past 8 years is gray China. You can travel almost all over China for most of this last 8 years, and you just see smog after smog after smog in cities like Chongqing, Henan, this near Zhengzhou, and Gansu. You can't see that at all. Trust me, it's pretty bad. And wow, you really can't see it there. You can just about make out a building there. But that's a picture I took in Beijing, my home, just last year. Now, hopefully some of you are saying at this point, well, so what? Every country's gone through its dirty phase of development. In Victorian Britain, Charles Dickens' smokers talked about smoke curling up out of the chimney pots, making a soft black drizzle, as if in mourning for the death of the sun. You know, Britain went through this, US has been through it, Japan's been through it, and this is the model of the cleanup normally. Countries start here, developing. They're very poor and very clean. And then they go through this very rapid phase of dirty growth, where they burn lots of coal, cut down lots of trees, don't deal with their waste. And then they reach a turning point. Depends on the country, but $5,000 to $8,000. And at that point, people decide we don't want to live in a pigsty anymore. And they start trying to clear up, and they do. And then they carry on growing, green growth in a way. And they continue to grow, they get richer, but they get cleaner. They plant more trees, and so forth. And it has to be hoped that China will follow the same path. But will it? I think this is the question. Clearly, on days like this, you wonder. Exactly the same for you. On days like this, you think, yes, it's moving ahead very rapidly. But China faces exceptional challenges that other countries did not face. And those challenges are related to the timing of its rise. And this is very important, because when we consider how countries have cleaned up in the past, there's basically two ways. One reflects very well on us as human beings, which is that we get smarter. We use our brains and our money and technology to clean up. This is the idea of sustainable growth. But the other side that we tend not to emphasize very much is that a part of the cleanup is often being irresponsible. It's dumping our dirty, polluting, energy-intensive industries on other countries that are coming up behind us. Britain did it to Europe, Europe did it to the US did it to Japan, then Taiwan, then Hong Kong, and now basically everybody's dumped their problems on China. So would China, I'm sure, would like to do the same thing. But it's harder for China, even though it's trying to do some of the same things, extracting resources from more and more from Africa and South America and Southeast Asia. It's harder. It's harder because of what are essentially economic factors, but it's harder because of the timing, as I said. And the timing relates to consumption and how mankind is consuming more and more of the world's resources, and how I hope when you consider sustainability, you really look at this level of consumption, not just production and supply chains. Because when we look at the energy we use as a human population, I've tried to show on this graph how mankind's jaws are getting wider and wider. So for hundreds of years, the top gray part, this is the human population, and it would have fluctuated inside this bar for a very long time, up until about the Industrial Revolution, and then it takes off, as we all know. The bottom half is how much energy we use per person, the calories, the kilowatts. Again, it would have been fairly fluctuating inside this bar for hundreds of years. Then we get to the Industrial Revolution, and wham, suddenly we're all using a great deal more energy. So this is how we've moved forward very dramatically in the last 200 years, and it probably seemed like a great idea when this model started, this industrial model started, in my country, Britain, where there was a huge development space, the rest of the world, for a fairly small country. But now, we're 200 years on, there's a lot less of a development space for a much bigger country. It's as if there's been this 200-year-long feast, and most of the food is gone just as the hungriest, biggest guest arrives. And that is why China is often very stressed when it comes to big conferences like the one in Copenhagen, where it's being asked to make sacrifices. And it says, well, look at your history. So I think what China is having to do, because it cannot so easily outsource its environmental stress as other countries have done, what you're seeing is it's insourcing them. And development is happening at the same time. On the coastal area, that's very well developed, and those areas are starting to reach the peak, or maybe going over the peak of that developmental curve, and they're starting to try to clean up. The dirtier industries and the extractive industries are moving inland, further and further and further inland. So essentially what you're having is a country that's starting to eat itself. And one thing I've been very struck by in my time in China is how the places that I once considered the sort of epitome of remoteness and nature are no longer remote. They're no longer natural. To give you 3 examples, Inner Mongolia, the Gobi Desert, that area now is the heart of the rare earths industry and rare earths extraction. It's also the biggest coal producing area of China as of 2 years ago. Tibet, the highest place on earth, also for a long time, the epitome of remoteness. There is now a railway, of course, to Lhasa. That's also happened in my time here. And because of that railway, what you will see in the next 5-10 years is huge hydropower development along this river here, the Yangtze, as it's called in China and Tibet, or the Brahmaputra, as it's known in India. And then finally, Xinjiang, up there. There's the furthest west region of China, further from the sea than anywhere else on Earth, full of deserts and glaciers. This area has 40% of China's coal deposits, and until now they've never been tapped because it costs so much money to transport them from all this way inland to where they're needed, mostly out on the coast. That will change in the next 5 to 10 years. China can now gasify coal and liquefy coal. So it will be able to pipe that coal to where it's needed. So we're going to see Xinjiang become one of the big carbon centers of the world. It's been described as China's Saudi Arabia. And traveling like this and seeing that the highest place, the most remote place, the deserts, the forests, there's roads through them, they're being developed. On one side, that's wonderful for the economy, it raises the living standards of the people who are there, but it also suggests that there is not much more geographical space left. We're really pushing at the limits, and we're pushing at a number of other limits that are very evident in China. Water, as I said, being the biggest one, the expansion of deserts. This clicker, I'm not pointing well. You've seen this picture before, and it's hitting people individually. This lady is called Namuhua. She's Mongolian, and about 15 years ago, she decided she didn't want to be a poor herder anymore, so she and some other friends got together, pooled their money, and invested in a tourist resort by a lake. They had boating trips and fishing, and they hoped to attract lots of visitors. But what happened? This is what happened to the lake. That is completely dry, and the wall you can see there is all that is left of the ticket office for the boats. And the pier was just behind that as well. So, of course, she's lost her livelihoods. There is a very severe economic impact to environmental degradation. Then, of course, there's pollution, which also has a very big impact both on the economy and people. The World Bank estimated in 2007 that the cost of pollution in China was equivalent to 5.8% of GDP. Now, if you take 5.8% away from GDP growth, China's GDP growth doesn't look half as impressive as we normally think of it. And it goes on somewhat. I realize I'm coming to the end of my time now, so I had actually wanted to go through a lot more of the positive things that China's doing, and perhaps we could talk about those afterwards. But I think that the essence of what I want to say, though, is that China really brings home the problems of trying to pursue GDP growth at any cost. Now, what is green growth? Is it quality or quantity? If it's quantity, I think we're in big trouble because we really are pushing at the edges in China. If it's quality, improved lifestyles, more satisfaction, more efficiency, then I think then that is the way to go forward. And I think China gets this. The country is doing a lot more than it's often given credit for in the outside world. But the Prime Minister Wen Jiabao is a trained geologist. President Hu Jintao is a trained hydro engineer. I call them President Water and Premier Earth. They know the problems. There's no denial of science. There's no denial that climate change is happening in the leadership inside China. And they are trying to do something. That's the essence of what they call scientific development, is sustainable development. They haven't got there yet, though. And I'm happy to take questions about where the problems are. But what is very clear is that a lot of the time in Europe, people just throw up their hands and say, oh my God, China is adding the equivalent of Britain's entire power supply every year. So what does it matter whether we turn our thermostat up or down a notch or two? I think, in fact, the opposite is true. China is trying to find a new model of growth, a new way of living, and they need examples. And I think places like Europe, people like you, are the type of people who can provide that example. So I will wrap up there for the moment, and I'm very happy to take any questions that any of you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was certainly a fascinating story. Maybe a thriller, because it sort of leaves you on the edge. There's a lot of cliffhangers there. And I guess that Jonathan will take some questions, so please think about what the key question is that you would like to ask Jonathan in a minute, and there's a microphone available. Just raise your hands. you've got time to think, because I've got a first question for you, Jonathan, and that is, there's so much talk about what's happening in the US. There's no political will. You've just said that in China that will is there. So there's this balance between maybe the two giants. But the push for becoming a green leader in China that you also talked about, and which looks quite successful in many ways, will that, do you think, be the thing that triggers the US to get out of the stalemate that they're in at the moment?
Right. Well, they are twins, very, very odd twins. The US is not doing much, and in many ways blaming its reliance on fossil fuels. It's also blamed on over excessive values, fundamentalist values. China, on the other hand, is all top-down science and not very much coming up, not very much happening by contrast on the grassroots. You often see American NGOs trying to goad their country into action by saying, look what China's doing, look what China's doing. And indeed, compared to the US, I think it's definitely doing a great deal at a government level. But before we get too carried away and start talking about China as this green superpower, it is not yet, not by any means. Let's look at some of the targets. They plan, yes, they've set their first carbon target to reduce carbon intensity by 40 to 45% by 2020. But the economy is growing so fast that there was a report out last week that said they will reach their goal, but they will also emit 1 gigaton more than expected by 2020. So the overall total is getting worse and worse. And yes, they're investing a great deal in, for example, electric cars. But electric car growth last year was nowhere near the growth in Lamborghinis and SUVs. And so I think China is still moving in the wrong direction, despite what its government is trying to do. The overall trend is still towards consuming more, using up more resources, and the marginal efficiency gains are being outweighed by the overall economic expansion.
Okay, so we do sometimes tend to, in the sustainability arena, to maybe have too glossy a picture of what's going on in China. Is that what you're saying?
I think we need to recognize the good that's being done, but I think it's naive to think China's going to solve our problems. And I hear that from time to time. You know, China's going to save us. They're the clever engineers who have worked out what to do. They haven't worked out what to do. They're trying to work out what to do. But I think they are as lost as any other country. And if anything, they're in a tougher position.
Okay. So a question down here. Please state your name.
My name is Carsten Kapian. I'm from Rumble Energy. I'd like to ask you about the China's reluctance to enter into a legally binding agreement on climate change. Where do you see the main obstacle for that happening? Because where do you see the main obstacle for China committing to a binding target on climate change? Is that they don't know where they're going, or is it because of other reasons?
Well, the binding or non-binding is they haven't signed up as an Annex 1 party, and they're not likely to do that yet. But they have made their pledge that they consider legally binding. It's more a semantic issue, this binding, non-legally binding. They are on course to meet their goals. Lots of other countries haven't been. I think the key is trying to get that goal more ambitious rather than worrying whether it's binding or not legally binding. And to having China set not just an intensity target relative